She stopped walking, just stopped, mid-step, in the middle of the muddy compound yard of the prisoner of war camp near her mouth slightly open, staring upward at something that, according to everything she had ever been taught, every certainty she had built her life upon, could not possibly exist. An aircraft was approaching the airfield adjacent to the campus C-47 transport plane, its twin engines rumbling across the gray German sky of June 1945. This was unremarkable. American aircraft had been crossing German skies for years, first as terrifying instruments of destruction raining bombs on cities, now as routine parts of the occupation machinery moving supplies and personnel across the conquered Reich. But what made Greta Hoffmann 26 years old, former Luftwaffe Communications Auxiliary, now a prisoner of the victorious Americans' freeze, in absolute incomprehension, was what she saw when the aircraft landed and taxied to a stop. The cockpit canopy opened, and the pilot, who climbed down from that aircraft, moving with practiced efficiency, wearing a flight suit and carrying charts under one arm, was a woman. A woman flying a military transport aircraft. Alone. Commanding that machine as naturally as Greta might have answered a telephone at her former post. The woman pilot walked across the tarmac toward the base operations building, her stride confident and purposeful, her flight suit marked with insignia that indicated she was not merely a passenger or assistant, but an actual, qualified, authorized military pilot. Greta's companion, another German prisoner named Ilse, who had served in the same communications unit, grabbed her arm. "Did you see that?" Ilse whispered in German, her voice tight with shock. A woman. Flying the plane, not sitting in it. Flying it. Around them, other German female prisoners had noticed too. Work details paused. Women stood staring. Some pointed. A few laughed, nervously. The kind of laughter that emerges when reality violates expectations so completely that the mind cannot process what the eyes are seeing. Others simply stared in silent disbelief, their faces registering the profound cognitive dissonance of witnessing something their entire ideological framework insisted was impossible. This moment, this simple observation of a female pilot performing a routine flight would be repeated across dozens of POW camps, displaced persons facilities, and occupation zones throughout the spring and summer of 1945. German women encountered American women pilots who shattered every assumption they held about femininity, capability, and the fundamental nature of what women could and could not do. For the German women prisoners, many of whom had themselves served in militarized auxiliary roles, the shock was not merely about seeing women doing work coded as masculine. They themselves had operated radio equipment, manned anti-aircraft search, and performed duties that technically violated the Nazi ideal of women's proper domestic sphere. But those roles had always been framed as auxiliary, as temporary wartime necessity, as distinctly subordinate to male authority. A woman pilot was different. A pilot commanded the aircraft. A pilot made life and death decisions. A pilot possessed technical mastery of complex machinery and navigated three-dimensional space at high speeds. A pilot exercised authority that was absolute within her domain, the aircraft she commanded, and that authority was respected, formalized, and institutionalized within the military structure. Nazi ideology had been explicit and unwavering on this point. Women could not and should not fly military aircraft. Such work required masculine qualities, spatial reasoning, mechanical aptitude, physical strength, cool judgment, under pressure, command presence. Women who attempted such roles were betraying their essential nature, perverting the natural order, and weakening their civilization by trying to be what they could never be. Yet here was undeniable evidence to the contrary. Not one woman in one plane is an aberration, but multiple women flying multiple aircraft, day after day, with the casual routine of people performing a job they were entirely qualified to do. The American women pilots who flew into German airspace in 1945, members of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP, and later, the Women's Army Corps, WWII. Aviation personnel had no idea that their routine flights were delivering psychological shocks that would reverberate through German women's consciousness for decades. This is the story of that encounter between Nazi gender ideology and American women's aviation service, between German women prisoners who had been taught what was possible and American women pilots who had proven those teachings catastrophically wrong. It is a story about the women Air Force Service pilots who flew over 60 million miles in military aircraft during the war, performing every non-combat aviation duty the military required. It is about the profound cognitive dissonance that occurs when reality forcefully contradicts fundamental beliefs. And it is about the moment when thousands of German women had to confront the possibility that if women could fly military aircraft with competence and authority, then perhaps everything else they had been taught about gender, capability, and their own potential was equally false. To understand why the sight of women pilots in flight suits provoked such intense psychological shock in German female prisoners of gender that had shaped their entire worldview, and particularly how that ideology addressed the relationship between women and aviation. The Nazi conception of proper gender roles was not merely conservative or traditional, it was totalitarian in its comprehensiveness and claimed to be rooted in biological and racial science. Nazi ideologists argued that men and women were fundamentally different, not just in reproductive function, but in cognitive abilities, psychological qualities, and proper social roles. These differences were presented as immutable laws of nature, discovered by racial science, and any attempt to violate them was portrayed as both futile and dangerous to racial health. Women's proper sphere, according to Nazi doctrine, was defined by the famous slogan, Kinder, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. But the ideology went far deeper than this slogan suggested. These qualities made them excellent mothers and homemakers, but these same qualities supposedly made them unsuited for roles requiring abstract reasoning, mechanical thinking, spatial visualization, or command authority. Aviation, in Nazi ideology, was quintessentially masculine. The airplane was a machine, machines were men's domain. Flying required spatial reasoning, mechanical understanding, and the ability to think in 3 dimensions, while managing multiple systems simultaneously. Nazi aviation propaganda celebrated male pilots as embodiments of masculine virtues: courage, technical mastery, command presence, and the warrior spirit. The image of the German fighter, cool, calculating, dominating the sky was iconically male. Nazi Germany did have some prominent female aviators from the pre-Nazi era, most notably the test pilot Hannah Reich and the aviation record holder Ellie Bunn, masculine anomalies who proved the rule rather than challenging it. Reich was portrayed as possessing masculine qualities that made her unusual among women, and her achievements were framed as serving the nation in the fore rather than as demonstrations of women's general capability. While the USSR trained women to fly combat missions, producing legendary pilots like Lydia Lidvack, who shot down German aircraft, and while the United States eventually created the WASP program for domestic aviation duties, Nazi Germany resisted female pilot programs even as military necessity became desperate. He believed it violated German women's essential nature and would degrade German civilization. Throughout the war, even as Germany faced catastrophic pilot shortages, the regime refused to train women as military pilots, that women were fundamentally incapable of such work and that attempting it would corrupt them and weaken the nation. German women growing up under Nazi rule absorbed these messages from every direction. In school, girls learned about their future roles as mothers and homemakers. The League of German Girls Bund, Deutscher M. The female branch of the Hitler Youth, prepared girls for domestic life and motherhood, not for technical careers or military service. Physical education emphasized fitness for childbearing, not for operating machinery or commanding equipment. The few German women who did receive technical education, Tanakri, Tunnelferinen communications auxiliaries, and Luftwaffen, Helfen, Air Force auxiliaries, who would later become POWs, had learned skills that were carefully circumscribed. They could operate telephones, telegraphs, and radios communications. Equipment that was seen as appropriately feminine because it involved talking and conveying messages. They could work with some technical systems, but always under male supervision and always in subordinate roles. Even these women, who had pushed against gender boundaries by serving in quasi-military capacities, had internalized the core message. There were limits to what women could do. Certain roles: pilot, tank commander, ship captain, artillery director, or masculine domains that women could not enter without violating their essential nature and the natural order. This ideological framework made the encounter with American women pilots particularly devastating. These German women weren't sheltered civilians who had never thought about gender roles. They were women who had themselves served in militarized capacities, who'd stretched the boundaries of what Nazi ideology supposedly allowed. Yet they had done so while maintaining the core belief that true command roles, particularly those involving complex machinery like aircraft, remained properly masculine. Seeing a woman pilot shattered that final boundary. If women could fly military aircraft, if they could command those machines with evident competence and institutional authorization, then the entire edifice of gender ideology was revealed as constructed rather than natural, as political rather than biological, as choice rather than necessity. The United States was undertaking an experiment that would eventually put over 1,000 women in military aircraft cockpits, flying every type of plane the Army Air Forces possessed except for combat missions overseas. The Women Air Force Service. Pilots WASP was established in August 1943 through the merger of two earlier programs. It grew from the vision of legendary pilot Jacqueline Cochran and aviation pioneer Nancy Harkness Love, who recognized that America had faced a pilot shortage and that qualified women pilots could fill crucial non-combat aviation roles. By the program's end in December 1944, 1,074 women had earned their Silver WASP wings, serving as military pilots in all but official status. The WASP flew every aircraft in the American arsenal. They ferried fighters from factories to embarkation points: P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings. They delivered bombers across the country: B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, and the massive B-29. They towed targets for live anti-aircraft gunnery practice. With male artillery crews shooting at targets, the women pilots pulled behind their aircraft. They test flew repaired aircraft to ensure they were safe for return to service. A dangerous duty that killed several WASP pilots. They trained male combat pilots, serving as flight instructors and demonstrating aircraft capabilities. The aircraft they flew were not gentle machines. The B-26 Marauder had such a high accident rate, it was called the Widowmaker. Yet WASP pilots flew it routinely. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced and complex bomber in the world, with a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and engines that were temperamental and prone to fire. WASP pilots ferried these aircraft across the country and demonstrated their capabilities to skeptical male crews. The training was rigorous and standardized to military specifications. WASP candidates underwent the same primary, basic, and advanced flight training as male Army Air Forces pilots. They learned aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology, military regulations, and aircraft systems. They flew in formation, performed instrument approaches in bad weather, and mastered both single-engine and multi-engine aircraft. The washout rate was high. About 40% of candidates failed to complete the program, ensuring that those who graduated were genuinely qualified pilots by military standards. 38 WASP pilots died in service. They died in crashes, in mid-air collisions, in aircraft that malfunctioned or caught fire. One WASP pilot, Herderd Tompkins, died when the target she was towing broke loose and struck her aircraft. Another, Mabel Rawlinson, died when the engine on her training aircraft failed during takeoff. Their bodies were sent home in plain wooden caskets at their families' expense because they were not officially military personnel and thus not entitled to military burial honors or death benefits. The WASP pilots who flew in the final year of the war and into the occupation period performed crucial transportation missions. They ferried personnel and cargo in transport aircraft, delivered priority supplies to bases across the United States, and eventually to occupied territories, and provided aviation support for the massive logistical enterprise of demobilization and occupation. Some WASP pilots participated in secret missions testing experimental aircraft and equipment that would shape post-war aviation. Their professionalism was exemplary. Military evaluations consistently rated WASP pilots as equal to or better than comparable male pilots in safety records, adherence to regulations, and mission completion rates. Male commanders who had initially been skeptical of women pilots became advocates after working with them. The evidence was undeniable. Women could fly military aircraft competently and safely. Yet despite this record, the WASP program was deactivated in December 1944, before the war's end. Congress had refused to grant the WASP military status and with male pilots returning from combat theaters, the military decided female pilots were no longer necessary. The women who had flown millions of miles in military aircraft were dismissed, told to go home, and denied veteran status. They received no GI Bill benefits, no veteran medical care, no recognition of their service. It would take until 1977, 33 years later, for Congress to finally grant WASP pilots veteran status and acknowledge their military service. But in 1945, as American forces occupied Germany, some of these women pilots were still flying. A few WASP members who had not yet been discharged continued ferrying aircraft in the immediate post-war period. More significantly, as the Army restructured for the occupation and the newly formed Women's Army Corps expanded, some women who had been WASP pilots transitioned into WAC service and continued flying in various capacities. Additionally, Army nurses and other military women sometimes received flight training for administrative or transport purposes. These were the women whom German female prisoners saw emerging from aircraft in flight suits, carrying charts and logbooks, moving with the confident professionalism of people who were exactly where they belonged. And for German women who had been taught that such sights were impossible, the psychological impact was profound and disorienting. The encounters between German female prisoners and American women pilots occurred across multiple locations and contexts throughout the spring and summer of 1945, each instance delivering a shock that seemed to intensify rather than diminish with repetition. At a POW camp near Munich in late May 1945, a group of approximately 40 German women former Luftwaffe auxiliaries who had operated communications equipment at air bases were assigned to a work detail at the adjacent American airfield. Their task was to assist with sorting and organizing supplies in warehouses near the flight line. It was routine labor that kept them busy and allowed American authorities to utilize POW labor while maintaining security. On their third day of work, a C-47 transport aircraft landed and taxied to a spot visible from the warehouse. The German women, accustomed to aircraft after years of service at Luftwaffe installations, paid little attention initially. Aircraft were machinery, familiar and unremarkable, but then they saw the pilot emerge from the cockpit. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several women gasped audibly. Others grabbed companions' arms, pointing. One woman dropped the crate she was carrying. An American guard, noticing the commotion, barked for them to get back to work, but even he seemed amused by their obvious shock. The pilot in question, American woman whose name was never recorded in the informal accounts of this incident, was simply doing her job. She had delivered cargo, would pick up returning supplies or personnel, and would fly back to her origin point. It was a routine ferrying mission of the type she had performed dozens or hundreds of times. She had no idea that her presence was delivering a psychological shock to the German women watching her. One of those German women, Margarete Bouet, later described the moment in an interview conducted in the 1980s. I had seen women in American uniform before. There was strange enough women with rank, giving orders to men. But a pilot? Flying that massive aircraft alone? I thought there must be a mistake. Perhaps she was delivering the plane to a male pilot. Or perhaps she was a passenger who happened to be sitting in the cockpit. But then I saw her carrying the flight log, checking the aircraft with the authority of someone who commanded it. And I understood. She was the pilot. The pilot. I couldn't believe it. In all my years at Luftwaffe bases, I never saw a woman fly an aircraft. We were taught it was impossible, that women lacked the necessary abilities. Yet here was proof that everything we were taught was false. Did she fly alone? Yes. Was this unusual? No. There were many women pilots in American service. Did they fly in combat? Some, especially Soviet women. Yes, American women flew every duty except direct combat overseas. Each answer contradicted German ideological certainty. The questions continued. How were women trained to fly? The same as men. Did male pilots respect them? Yes, military evaluations showed women pilots were equally or more capable. Were these women considered masculine or abnormal? No. They were respected as professionals, and many had families. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were not sheltered civilians hearing propaganda. These were women who had served in military structures, who understood aviation operations, who had worked alongside male pilots and crews. They knew what flying required, and they had been certain that women could not do it. At another location, a displaced persons processing center near Frankfurt, a similar encounter occurred with different dynamics. A small aircraft liaison plane used for courier service and transporting officers landed at a nearby airstrip. The pilot, an American woman in flight suit, walked to the processing center carrying messages and documents for the administrative officers. A group of German women detainees, including several former concentration camp guards awaiting investigation and trial, watched her arrive, and made a comment in German, suggesting the woman must be the pilot's assistant or companion, not the actual pilot. An American officer who spoke German overheard and corrected her. "That's Lieutenant Morrison. She's been flying for 3 years. Probably has more flight hours than most of your Luftwaffe pilots had when they died. She is here because she is the best courier pilot in this sector, not because she is pretty or someone's girlfriend, but because she's the most skilled and reliable pilot available." The German women fell silent. The ideological framework that would have allowed them to dismiss a woman pilot as an aberration or propaganda could survive the matter-of-fact reality of institutional aviation programs that employed women systematically and evaluated them by the same standards as men. At a third, location. Former German women pilots, the tiny number who had managed to obtain pilot licenses in Germany or who had been involved in gliding clubs, had an even more complex reaction. These women knew what flying required, knew the exhilaration and challenge of controlling an aircraft, but they had been told repeatedly that their flying was a hobby, certainly never to be formalized into military service. One such woman, Annemarie Schmidt, who had been a glider instructor before the war, watched an American woman pilot taxi a fighter aircraft and later spoke with her through an interpreter. The American had ferried the P-51 Mustang from a depot to a forward base and spoke casually about the flight. Schmidt later wrote in her memoir, "I had flown gliders, beautiful, silent flight, pure and simple. Yet here was this American woman, younger than me, who had flown this fighter aircraft, this incredible machine of war as casually as I might have driven an automobile." She spoke of flight hours in the thousands, of aircraft I could only dream of flying, and I realized that what I had been told were my natural limitations were actually just limitations my society had imposed. Was more capable because her society had given her opportunities mine had denied me. The psychological impact of seeing women pilots and German female prisoners went far beyond simple surprise. It triggered a cascade of cognitive and emotional responses that forced a fundamental reassessment of reality, capability, and their own potential. Cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when confronted with information that contradicts deeply held beliefs, operates most powerfully when the contradictory evidence is undeniable and personally relevant. For German women prisoners, the sight of women pilots provided both qualities in overwhelming measure. The evidence was undeniable. This was not propaganda or rumor. These were real women, in real aircraft, performing real aviation duties, with obvious competence and institutional authority. The prisoners could see the aircraft land and take off. They could observe the women pilots walking with confidence, carrying flight logs and charts, consulting with male crews and commanders who treated them as colleagues rather than as oddities or The evidence was also personally relevant, like professional people doing a job they were qualified to do. For many German women, this realization led to anger directed sometimes at Americans for shattering their worldview, but more often at their own society and leaders for lying to them. Why did they tell us women couldn't do this? Why did they limit us based on false claims about our nature? What else have they lied about? This anger often gave way to grief for opportunities never offered, for potential never developed. 4 years spent believing they were less capable than they actually were. Women who might have become pilots, engineers, commanders, or scientists if born in a different society mourned the lives they might have lived. Some German women experienced not grief but excitement and hope. If women could fly aircraft, if those supposed natural limitations were actually just social restrictions, then perhaps the future could be different from the past. Perhaps German women in the post-war world could develop capabilities their mother's generation had been denied. The most profound psychological impact was existential. If fundamental beliefs about gender and capability were wrong, what else might be wrong? as political rather than scientific, as mutable rather than eternal. One German prisoner, Edeka Zimmermann, who had served as a Luftwaffe communications officer, articulated this realization in a letter to her sister written from a camp in July 1945. I saw an American woman land a fighter aircraft today. I don't think I can make you understand what this means to me. Not just that, women can fly though. That alone overturns everything we were taught. But that everything we were told about nature and race and the proper order of things was a lie. If they lied about something so fundamental as what women can do, they lied about everything else. I served those lies for 6 years. I believed them, and now I see them for what they were. Just lies that men told to maintain their power. This psychological transformation was not universal. Some German women maintained their ideological commitments, despite contradictory evidence. They dismissed women pilots as aberrations, insisted that American society was degenerate, precisely because it allowed such unnatural role violations, or argued that whatever short-term utility women pilots might have, traditional gender roles would and should reassert themselves. The encounter with women pilots became a pivot point, a moment when one worldview collapsed and the space opened for constructing a different understanding of themselves, their capabilities, and their potential futures. Perhaps the most psychologically complex encounters occurred when German women who had some aviation connection, the rare pre-war women pilots, glider enthusiasts, or those who had worked in aviation support, roles had direct interactions with American women pilots. These encounters between women who shared a connection to flight, despite being on opposite sides of history's most terrible conflict. At an American air base near Stuttgart, where German POW labor was used for maintenance and logistics, an American woman pilot named Captain Sarah Chun, one of the former WASP pilots who had transitioned into WWII service, was conducting a pre-flight inspection on her aircraft when a German woman prisoner approached. The woman, Lotte Hirsch, Excuse me, Lotte began, her voice uncertain. You are, the pilot of this aircraft. Captain Chun looked up from her checklist. Yes, I'm the pilot. Is there something you need? I worked at an airbase for the Luftwaffe. I was never allowed near the aircraft. Only men could fly. Only men could be pilots. But I've been flying for 4 years, Chun replied, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. Military aircraft for 3 of those years. This is a C-47 good aircraft. Reliable, EC-2, and the... I'll be ferrying it to Marseille today. Lotte struggled to articulate what she wanted to say. How did you become a pilot? In Germany, women who wanted to fly were told it was impossible, that we lacked the ability. Even women who had pilot licenses before the war were never allowed to fly military aircraft. Yet Chun paused in her inspection and looked at the German woman with a mixture of sympathy and something harder to define. Your country wasted half its population by telling women they could undo things they were perfectly capable of doing. Well, we're not perfect either. They disbanded the WASP program before the war ended, told us to go home, refused to give us military status. But at least we got the chance to prove what we could do. At least we flew. They had possessed a capability, the spatial reasoning, the mechanical understanding. Another encounter occurred between an American nurse who had received flight training for medical evacuation work and a former German woman who had participated in pre-war gliding competitions. They met during processing at a displaced persons facility, and after initial wariness, discovered their shared passion for flight. The German woman, whose name was recorded only as Helga K. in official reports, asked questions that revealed her hunger for information about what might have been. What was training like? How did American women learn navigation? Were they allowed to fly at night? In bad weather, did male pilots respect them or resent them? The American nurse answered patiently, describing the training regimen, the challenges, the discrimination that certainly existed but that could be overcome through demonstrated competence. She described the satisfaction of flying, the pride of mastering complex machines, the professional respect earned through skill. Helga listened with visible emotion. But I was told it was not appropriate. that I should focus on preparing for marriage and motherhood. I accepted what they told me. I didn't fight it, and now I see what I could have been if I had been born somewhere else, or if I had been brave enough to refuse their limitations. Aviation served as a concrete, specific domain in which capability could be objectively demonstrated. You either could fly an aircraft competently or you couldn't. There was no ambiguity, no room for subjective judgment clouded by ideology. Had operated the most advanced aircraft in the world, and had done so with proven competence. For German women who understood what flying required, this concrete demonstration of capability undermined ideological claims in a way that abstract arguments never could. They knew the challenges of flight. They knew the skills required, and they could not dismiss or explain away the evidence that women possessed those skills when given the opportunity to develop them. Some German women with aviation backgrounds began to ask different questions. Not just how did American women become pilots, but how can we ensure German women have such opportunities in the future? These questions represented a fundamental shift from accepting limitations to imagining alternatives, from believing in fixed gender roles to recognizing the possibility of change. One former German glider instructor, Anneliese Burke, had a conversation with an American pilot that she would describe decades later as life. The American spoke casually about her wartime service, the aircraft she had flown, the mission she had completed. Then she said something that Burke never forgot. The difference between us isn't ability, it's opportunity. Your society told you no. Mine eventually said yes reluctantly. Temporarily, but yes. The difference between a woman who flies and a woman who doesn't isn't natural ability. It's whether someone gives her a chance. The encounters between German female prisoners and American women pilots in 1945 had effects that rippled forward through decades, influencing individual lives, shaping German post-war society, and contributing to broader transformations in women's roles. For individual German women, the memory of seeing women pilots often became a pivotal moment in their personal narratives, a point where one understanding of the possible ended and another began. Interviews conducted decades later found that many German women could still recall the specific moment, the specific aircraft, sometimes even details about what the American pilot was wearing or how she moved. These memories often became part of larger stories of personal transformation. Women would describe their lives in terms of before and after seeing women pilots, when they accepted limits on their potential, and after, when they began to question those limits and imagine different possibilities. Some German women who saw American women pilots in 1945 went on to pursue aviation careers in the post-war years. West Germany's aviation industry, initially restricted by occupation authorities but gradually rebuilt, eventually included women pilots, mechanics, and engineers. Several of these women explicitly credited their 1945 encounters with American women pilots as inspiration for pursuing aviation careers that would have been unthinkable before the war. Anneliese Burke, the former glider instructor who spoke with an American pilot, later became one of West Germany's early women commercial pilots. In interviews, she consistently described seeing American women pilots in 1945 as the moment that showed her what was possible. Before that, I had accepted that serious aviation was not for women. After seeing those American pilots, I understood that the limitation was political, not natural. So I decided to make it political in the other direction, to fight for the right to fly professionally. But the impact extended beyond individuals who pursued aviation careers. The broader lesson that supposed natural limitations were actually social constructions that could be changed influenced German women's approach to education, careers, and public life in the post-war years. West Germany in the 1950s underwent a complicated negotiation around gender roles. Traditional domesticity was heavily promoted as part of Reconstruction and Cold War ideology. The ideal of the housewife and mother was celebrated. Many women who had worked during the war were pushed back into domestic roles. Yet beneath this surface traditionalism, seeds of change were germinating. Women who had been exposed to alternative models, including through encounters with American military women in the occupation years, knowledge that women could do more. When the women's movement emerged in West Germany in the 1960s and 1970s, it drew partly on these retained memories and alternative visions. The specific legacy of women pilots was preserved in surprising ways. The story of Hannah Reich, the famous German test pilot, was rehabilitated in the 1950s. partly because post-war Germans could now appreciate her achievements in a new context. If American and Soviet women could fly military aircraft competently, then perhaps Reich had not been an aberration, but a pioneer who could have been the first of many if society had been different. In East Germany, the legacy played out differently, but with some parallels. The socialist state promoted women's participation in all fields as ideological principle, and women's aviation became part of demonstrating socialism's superiority over Western capitalism. But East German women who had seen or heard about American and Soviet women pilots in 1945 understood that this socialist promotion of women's aviation was not unprecedented. It was catching up to what others had already demonstrated. The broader legacy extended to how Germans remembered and taught about World War II. The fact that American and Soviet women had served competently in roles Nazi ideology claimed were impossible became part of the evidence used to demonstrate Nazism's fundamental wrongness. Teachers could point not just to the Holocaust and aggressive war, but to the systematic waste of human potential through false ideology about race and gender. The Nazis told lies about many things, became a common educational refrain, including lies about what women could and couldn't do. American women flew military aircraft, while Nazi Germany insisted this was impossible. This should teach us to question authority and to reject claims about natural limitations that are really just social prejudices. The American WASP pilots, meanwhile, fought their own long battle for recognition. Denied military status during the war and discharged without benefits in 1944. They spent decades seeking acknowledgement of their service, the sight of their achievements influencing German women's consciousness would have been ironic. They helped shatter Nazi ideology about women's limitations, while their own country denied them full recognition of their military service. It wasn't until 1977 that Congress finally granted WASP pilots veteran status. It wasn't until 2010 that they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. By then, many WASP pilots had died without ever receiving the recognition they deserved. But those who survived to see these honors acknowledged that their service had mattered not just for the missions they flew, but for what they proved about women's capabilities. Imagine it's 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Amidst the ruins of a defeated Germany, a group of female prisoners looks up at the sky. They see an American military aircraft, and in the cockpit, a woman. For these German women, raised on an ideology that defined their roles as strictly domestic, this sight was more than just a curiosity. It was a revelation, a moment that would shatter their worldview and plant a seed of change that would blossom over decades. The encounters between German women and American women pilots in 1945 were brief, often just fleeting glimpses. But their impact was profound and lasting. It rippled through individual lives, reshaped German society, and contributed to a global transformation in the perception of women's roles. For many of these German women, this was a pivotal moment in their personal history, a clear dividing line in their lives. Years later, when historians and researchers conducted interviews, the memories were still vivid. Women in their 70s and 80s could recall the exact moment, the type of aircraft, and even small details about the American pilot's appearance or uniform, the way she carried herself. These weren't just simple memories. They became foundational stories of personal transformation. Many described their lives in terms of before and after seeing those women fly. Before, they had accepted the limitations placed upon them by society. After, they began to question everything. They started to imagine a different world, a different future for themselves. This inspiration wasn't just a fleeting feeling. For some, it was a direct call to action. Take Anneliese Berg, a former glider instructor in Germany. She had a conversation with one of these American pilots. That brief exchange changed the course of her life. In the post-war years, as West Germany slowly rebuilt its aviation industry under Allied restrictions, Anneliese fought for her place in it. She went on to become one of West Germany's first female commercial pilots. In interviews, she consistently pointed back to that moment in 1945. She said, "Before that, I had accepted that serious aviation was not for women. After seeing those American pilots, I understood that the limitation was political, not natural. So I decided to make it political in the other direction to fight for the right to fly professionally." Anneliese wasn't alone. Several other German women who witnessed these American aviators went on to pursue careers in aviation, becoming pilots, mechanics, and engineers in a field that had been unthinkable for them just a few years prior. They saw proof that the barriers they faced were not inherent to their gender, but were constructed by society. And if they were constructed, they could also be dismantled. But the impact wasn't limited to those who took to the skies. The broader lesson that so-called natural limitations were often just social prejudices in disguise seeped into the collective consciousness of German women. This idea influenced their approach to education, to careers, and to their role in public life. The 1950s in West Germany were a complex time for women. On the one hand, there was a strong push to return to traditional values. The ideal of the housewife and mother was promoted as essential for rebuilding the nation and as a pillar of Cold War stability. Many women who had worked in factories and other essential roles during the war were encouraged, and sometimes pressured, to return to the home. It was a period of seeming regression, a retreat into conservative domesticity. Yet, beneath this traditional surface, the seeds of change sown in 1945 were quietly germinating. The women who had seen American military women, who had witnessed their competence and confidence, held on to that knowledge. They knew that other possibilities existed. This retained memory of an alternative reality became a powerful undercurrent. When the women's liberation movement gained momentum in West Germany during the 1960s and 70s, it drew strength from these hidden histories and alternative visions. The women who had seen pilots fly knew that the fight for equality was on a new or radical idea. It was a demand for rights that others had already proven they deserved. The legacy of female pilots was even preserved in surprising ways. Think of Hannah Reitsch, the famous German test pilot who was celebrated by the Nazi regime. After the war, her legacy was complicated by her association with the Nazis. But in the 1950s, her story was re-examined in a new context, where Germans now knew that American and Soviet women had also flown military aircraft with great skill. Reitsch's achievements were seen differently. Perhaps she wasn't just a unique exception, a freak of nature, but a pioneer. She could have been the first of many German female pilots if her society hadn't been so ideologically rigid. Across the border in East Germany, the story played out differently, but with similar echoes. The socialist government ideologically promoted the equality of women, encouraging their participation in all fields, including aviation. This was presented as proof of socialism's superiority over the capitalist West. But for the East German women who had seen or heard about the Allied female pilots in this wasn't a revolutionary new concept. They understood that their government's policy was on so much pioneering a new path as it was catching up to a reality that others had already demonstrated was possible. This story fundamentally changed how Germany came to terms with its own recent past. The fact that American and Soviet women had excelled in roles that Nazi ideology deemed impossible for them became a powerful tool for education. It was used as clear evidence to dismantle the lies of the Third Reich. When teaching the next generation about the evils of Nazism, educators could point not only to the horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation of war, but also to the systematic waste of human potential. The Nazi ideology was built on lies about race, and it was also built on lies about gender. A common refrain in German schools became, "The Nazis told lies about many things, including lies about what women could and couldn't do." American women flew military aircraft while Nazi Germany insisted this was impossible. This should teach us to question authority and to reject claims about natural limitations that are really just social prejudices. The image of a woman in the cockpit of a warplane became a symbol of truth against a backdrop of fascist lies. But while these American pilots were inspiring a quiet revolution in Germany, they were fighting a very different battle back home. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, had their own long struggle for recognition. During the war, they were technically civilians. They flew every type of military aircraft, ferried planes, tested new models, and trained male pilots, freeing up more men for combat roles. 38 of them lost their lives in service. Yet, they were denied official military status. In 1944, as the war was turning in the Allies' favor, the program was abruptly disbanded, and the women were sent home without any veterans' benefits, without even a flag for their coffins. It's a bitter irony. Their skill and presence helped shatter a key tenet of Nazi ideology in the minds of German women, while their own country refused to fully acknowledge their service. For decades, the WWII fought for what they had earned. It wasn't until 1977, more than 30 years after the war ended, that Congress finally granted them veteran status. And it took until 2010 for these pioneering women to be awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. By then, many of the WWII had passed away, never receiving the official recognition they so deeply deserved. But for those who survived to see these honors bestowed, it was a validation of their entire lives. They knew their service had mattered not just for the critical missions they flew, but for the powerful statement they made. They proved, beyond any doubt, what women were capable of. Their legacy is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful acts of change aren't loud explosions, but the quiet, undeniable sight of someone breaking a barrier, inspiring those watching to believe that they can break barriers too. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories. See you in the next one. Imagine this scene. It's 1945. Germany. A group of female prisoners, their minds shaped by years of Nazi ideology, stare up at the sky. An American military plane lands. The cockpit opens, and out steps a woman. In that moment, for those prisoners, an entire worldview began to crumble. 75 years later, what can we learn from that stunning encounter? This is a story about the line between what we retold is impossible and what is actually possible. Nazi ideology wasn't just a suggestion. It was presented as a scientific fact. Women couldn't fly military aircraft, they said. They lacked the spatial reasoning, the mechanical aptitude, the cool-headedness for split-second decisions under fire. These weren't cultural roles. They were declared to be unchangeable biological truths. But then, the truth landed right in front of them. The American Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, were living, breathing proof that this ideology was a lie. Over 1,000 of these incredible women, plus others in various aviation roles, flew every single type of aircraft in the American arsenal. They weren't just flying on sunny days. They flew in all weather conditions, delivering planes over thousands of miles. They test flew repaired aircraft, a notoriously dangerous job. They even towed targets for live fire, practice a task that required immense skill and courage. They trained male pilots and served as flight instructors. And the result? Their safety records and mission completion rates were just as good, and in some cases, even better than their male counterparts. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't a theory. It was cold, hard, empirical fact. A plane either lands safely or it doesn't. A mission succeeds or it fails. The evidence was undeniable. When given the training and the opportunity, women could fly military aircraft with exceptional competence. There was no room for biased interpretation. For the German women who witnessed this, the impact must have been shattering. This wasn't just about one belief. It was like pulling a single thread that unravels an entire tapestry. If the fact about women not being able to fly was a lie, then what else was? What did that say about the rigid gender roles their society was built on, which was built on similar claims of a natural hierarchy? What had their brothers and husbands died for? For many, that single image of a woman pilot in a flight suit became a powerful symbol. She was proof that the impossible was just something that hadn't been done yet. She was evidence that the limits they had been taught were not natural, but man-made. But history is rarely a simple hero story. We have to be careful not to overstate the impact of this single moment. Seeing women pilots didn't instantly denazify Germany. Social change is a slow, messy, and complicated process. Many people saw the same evidence and simply explained it away, finding ways to protect their existing beliefs. Ideology is stubborn, and here's the most complex part of the story. The very same American women who delivered this ideological shockwave were part of a society that still had its own rigid ideas about gender. The WASP program itself was disbanded before the war even ended. These women, who had proven their skill and bravery beyond any doubt, were essentially told their service was no longer needed, and they should go back home. It would take decades more of fighting for American women to gain full access to military aviation roles. So, this isn't a simple tale of an enlightened America teaching a backward Germany. It's much more nuanced. It's a story about how once a capability is demonstrated, once the truth is out there, it can't be completely erased. Even when the WWII program was shut down, even when these pilots were denied veteran status for years, the proof of what they had done remained. They had shown the world what was possible. The lesson from that day in 1945 is that evidence matters. Reality has a way of asserting itself, even against the most powerful ideologies. The story of the WWII pilots is a powerful reminder that the most formidable barriers we face are often the ones we build in our own minds. It's a testament to the idea that talent, courage, and capability don't have a gender. And once you prove something can be done, you change the conversation forever. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for German women who witnessed that proof, the knowledge remained even as West Germany promoted traditional gender roles in the 1950s. They knew what they had seen. They knew women could fly. That knowledge was a seed that would eventually grow into broader questioning and change. The story also teaches us about the power of concrete, specific evidence versus abstract ideology. Nazi ideology about gender was elaborate, systematic, and claimed scientific legitimacy. It was taught in schools, promoted in media, enforced by policy, and backed by state power. But it could not survive contact with a woman confidently walking away from an aircraft she had just piloted. One concrete example outweighed 1,000 theoretical arguments. This has implications for how we think about challenging false ideologies today. Abstract arguments about equality or capability are important, but they may be less powerful than concrete demonstrations. Showing what is possible can be more effective than arguing about what should be possible. The German women who wept when American nurses shared rations with them experienced one kind of ideological shock, the shock of receiving compassion from enemies they had been taught were monsters. The German women who stood stunned watching women pilots experienced a different but related shock, the shock of seeing capability they had been taught was impossible. Both shocks collapsed ideological certainties by confronting them with undeniable reality. Today, we continue to debate questions about capability, limitation, and potential across many domains, not just gender, but also race, class, disability, and other dimensions of human diversity. We continue to hear claims about what certain groups can or cannot do, often presented as natural facts rather than social judgments. The story of the German women prisoners and the American women pilots reminds us to be skeptical of such claims, especially when they conveniently justify existing hierarchies and restrictions. It reminds us that natural limitations often turn out to be social constructions when someone is finally given the opportunity to challenge them. And it reminds us that concrete, proof factual people doing the supposedly impossible things is more powerful than any amount of theoretical argument about why those things cannot be done. The women pilots who flew in World War II, American WASP pilots, Soviet combat pilots, and the smaller numbers of women from other nations who flew military aircraft did not set out to be feminists, pioneers, or ideological revolutionaries. They set out to fly, to serve, to contribute to winning a war. But in doing so, they provided proof that shattered false certainties about women's limitations. The German women prisoners who witnessed this proof carried it forward. Some built careers on it. Others passed the knowledge to daughters and granddaughters. Still others simply retained it as a reminder that what society claims is impossible may merely be what society has chosen not to allow. The flight suits those American women wore were functional clothing for a demanding job, nothing more. But two German women who had been taught that seeing a woman in a flight suit emerging from a cockpit was impossible. Those flight suits became symbols of a larger possibility that the world could be different from what they had been taught. That restrictions presented as natural could be overcome. That women's potential was far greater than Nazi ideology had allowed them to imagine. 75 years later, women fly fighter jets in combat, command spacecraft, pilot commercial airliners, and serve in every aviation role that exists. This seems normal now, unremarkable, simply the way things are. But it became possible because of the women who flew when it was still considered impossible, who proved through their service that the supposed limitations were lies, and who thereby opened possibilities, not just for themselves, but for all who came after. The German women who stood stunned in POW camps in 1945, watching women pilots with disbelieving eyes, were witnesses to a truth that would take decades to fully unfold. That human potential is vastly greater than any ideology admits, that supposed natural limits are often social constructions, and that one person confidently doing the supposedly impossible thing is worth more than 1,000 arguments about why it cannot be done. The flight suits, the aircraft, the WASPR program itself. All of these are now history. But the proof remains. The women flew. The aircraft landed safely. The missions succeeded. And nothing no ideology, no prejudice, no false claim about natural limitation can erase that empirical fact. The women flew, and in flying they changed not just aviation history, but human understanding of what women could be and do. That is the enduring legacy of the women in flight suits, who stunned German prisoners and shattered a worldview, with nothing more than competent professionalism and undeniable proof of capability. The sky, it turned out, belonged to anyone brave enough and skilled enough to claim it regardless of what ideology insisted was natural, proper, or possible. The German women learned this lesson in 1945 by watching American women walk away from aircraft they had just piloted. It was a lesson that would echo through generations. A reminder that when reality contradicts ideology, reality always wins in the end, and sometimes reality wears a flight suit and carries a logbook, and simply, by existing, shatters everything you thought you knew about what was possible. The German women prisoners' encounter with women pilots was shocking, but it was part of a larger pattern that spring and summer of 1945, their systematic exposure to American women serving in roles that Nazi ideology had insisted were impossible or improper for women. The Women's Army Corps fielded over 150,000 women in uniform, who performed hundreds of military occupational specialties. German prisoners encountered WWII members serving as military police, communications specialists, intelligence analysts, mechanics, drivers, administrators, and commanders. They saw women with rank who gave orders to men who obeyed without question or resentment. Army Nesezova, 59,000 of them served with courage and professionalism in every theater of war, including in forward surgical hospitals under fire. German prisoners who had served as nurses themselves recognized the extraordinary competence of their American counterparts, who had adequate supplies, professional training, and institutional respect that German nurses had often lacked. But women pilots represented something uniquely challenging to Nazi ideology. Driving a truck or operating a radio could be rationalized as extensions of traditionally feminine service, support. But flying an aircraft could not be similarly explained away. It required mastery of three-dimensional space, command of complex machinery, and absolute authority within the cockpit. The German prisoners were also aware, through conversations with American personnel and through the gradually more available American media, that the United States was not the only nation that had successfully utilized women in aviation roles. The Soviet Union had gone even further, training women as combat pilots who flew fighters and bombers against German forces. The Night Wichita, all-female, 588th Night Bomber Regiment had flown thousands of harassment bombing missions against German forces, flying obsolete biplanes at night with engines off, gliding in to drop bombs before the Germans could respond. German soldiers on the Eastern Front had nicknamed them Night Witches, for the whooshing sound their aircraft made in the glide approach, a sound that struck terror because it meant bombs were about to fall. Soviet women pilots had shot down German aircraft in aerial combat. Lydia Litviak, the White Rose of Stalingrad, had personally shot down 12 German aircraft before being killed in action at age 20. Her achievements were known to German pilots who had fought on the Eastern Front, though the Wehrmacht had tried to minimize or deny that women could be effective combat pilots. For German women learning about Soviet women combat pilots, the psychological impact was even more acute. These were UNC's women flying transport aircraft. In safe zones, these were women who had fought and killed German soldiers, who had demonstrated not just technical competence, but warrior spirit, who had proven themselves in the ultimate test of aerial combat. Nazi ideology had taught that women couldn't fly military aircraft, yet Americans flew them routinely in every non-combat role. Nazi ideology had taught that women couldn't fly in combat, Yet Soviet women had done exactly that, successfully, for years. Nazi ideology had taught that societies allowing such role violations would be weak and degenerate, yet those societies had defeated Germany. By limiting women's participation in aviation, Germany had denied itself a significant pool of capable personnel. By refusing to train women pilots, even when facing desperate pilot shortages in the war's final years, Germany had chosen ideological purity over military effectiveness. Some German prisoners began to articulate this realization explicitly. If Germany had trained women pilots, would the war have turned out differently? Probably not. The material disparity was too great. But would Germany have been able to sustain aerial operations longer? Would more experienced male pilots have survived if women had taken over domestic ferrying and training duties? Would the Luftwaffe's catastrophic pilot losses in 1944 and 1945 have been somewhat mitigated? These were counterfactual questions without definitive answers, but they forced German women to confront that ideology had costs, that choosing to limit women's participation based on false beliefs about their capabilities had weakened rather than strengthened German military power.